The silence in Interrogation Chamber 7 was a physical weight, a pressure against the ears designed to amplify the sound of a breaking will. It was a silence Kalen had cultivated, a weapon he wielded with the same dispassionate precision as a neural disruptor holstered at his hip. Here, in the heart of the consortium's justice spire, silence was the sound of order. It was the absence of emotion, of biology, of the chaotic symphony of scent and impulse the founders had so wisely excised from their perfect society. Kalen was a testament to that perfection, a regulator, first class, an omega, neutered and repurposed, his own biology a ghost story whispered in the sterile corridors of the creche where he was raised. He was a scalpel in the hand of director Valerius, sharp and clean and utterly without feeling. His reflection stared back at him from the one-way chrome steel mirror. A pale, severe face, eyes the color of a winter storm, framed by hair as black as the void between stars. The uniform was a second skin, a high-collared tunic of grey synth fabric that choked any hint of personal identity. There was no scent on him. The suppressants coursing through his veins were a marvel of biochemical engineering, a constant silent war waged against the very essence of his being. He was not an omega. He was a function, an instrument of state. The door hissed open, a clean pneumatic sigh. Two enforcers, their faces obscured by reflective visors, guided the prisoner into the chamber. They were brutalist architecture in motion, all hard lines and polished composite armor. Between them, the prisoner was a jarring slash of organic chaos. He was tall, built with a lean, wiry strength that the drab prisoner's jumpsuit could not entirely conceal. His hair was a dark, unruly mess, and a defiant smirk played on his lips, a stark contrast to the fresh bruise blooming on his cheekbone. But it was not his appearance that struck Kalen like a physical blow. It was the scent. It was an act of profound rebellion, unfiltered, unsuppressed. An alpha. The air, once so pure and sterile, was now saturated with it. The sharp, clean scent of ozone after a lightning strike, the deep, warm fragrance of pine resin and scorched earth. It was a scent that spoke of wildness, of freedom, of everything the consortium had declared profane. It filled Kalen's lungs, a trespass so profound it felt like a violation. He felt a tremor, a faint, unfamiliar vibration deep in his bones, a flicker in the placid sea of his chemically enforced neutrality. He crushed it instantly. It was a data anomaly, a physiological response to a foreign contaminant, nothing more. The prisoner was shackled to the interrogation chair in the center of the room. The enforcers withdrew, the door sealing behind them with that same final sighing hiss. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a charged silence, thick with the prisoner's scent, with the sheer, unapologetic fact of his existence. Designation. Reese, Kalen stated, his voice a flat monotone. He did not look at the prisoner, his gaze fixed on the datapad in his hand. Leader of the subversive cell known as the Embers, charged with sedition, biological terrorism, and conspiracy to dismantle the new order. The prisoner, Reese, let out a low chuckle. It was a rough, grating sound in the pristine silence. Biological terrorism? Is that what you call breathing? He lifted his head, and his eyes, a startling, vivid green, met Kalen's. They were not the eyes of a fanatic. They were clear, intelligent, and laced with a weary sort of amusement. You can smell me, can't you, regulator? It must be driving your programming haywire. Kalen's fingers tightened on the datapad. Your scent is an illegal contaminant. It will be neutralized. Go ahead, Rhys challenged, shifting in the chair, the movement sending a fresh wave of his scent across the room. Scrub the air. It won't matter. It's in your lungs now, in your blood. A little piece of the real world, right inside the consortium's perfect little machine. He leaned forward as much as the restraints would allow, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Tell me, what do they call you? My designation is not relevant, Kalen said, the words clipped. He forced himself to meet Rhys's gaze, to project the cold authority that was his shield and his sword. Oh, but it is, Rhys insisted. Because you're not just a regulator, are you? I can feel it. Under all that chemical poison, under all that training, there's something else, something you've been taught to hate. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of profound insight in their green depths. They made you a predator to hunt your own kind, but they couldn't carve it all out, could they? There's a ghost in the machine. Kalen's breath hitched, a tiny, infinitesimal betrayal. A ghost. That's what it felt like. A phantom limb, an echo of a self he had never been allowed to know. He had read the files, the classified reports on Omega biology. He knew, in a clinical, detached way, what he was, or what he would have been. Weak, unstable, a slave to instinct. The consortium had saved him from that. It had given him purpose, strength. You are a terrorist, Kalen stated, the words a shield. You seek to plunge society back into the chaos of the before times, a world ruled by base instinct, where the strong dominate the weak. We seek a world where people are allowed to be whole, Rhys countered, his voice losing its mocking edge, replaced by a quiet, fervent intensity. Where the scent of your mate on the wind isn't a crime, but a promise. Where you aren't forced to choose between your heart and your duty. What you call chaos, we call life. This, he gestured with his head to the sterile grey room. This is a tomb. For a flicker of a second, Kalen saw it. He saw the grey walls as the sides of a coffin, the filtered air as embalming fluid, his own uniform as a shroud. The image was so vivid, so visceral, it stole the air from his lungs. He blinked, and it was gone. The room was just a room. The uniform was just a uniform. He was just a regulator. The interrogation will now commence, Kalen said, his voice colder than before. You will provide the names of your co-conspirators, the locations of your cells, and the full extent of your network. Rhys leaned back against the chair, the defiant smirk returning. And if I don't? The silence in this room can be filled with many things, Kalen replied, his tone devoid of inflection. All of them unpleasant. We have methods that transcend the limitations of the physical body. We can peel back the layers of your mind, one by one, until nothing is left but the information we require. You can try, Rhys said, his green eyes holding Kalen's. But you can't take what's real. And what's real is that you are suffocating. And part of you, the part you're trying so hard to kill, knows it. Kalen turned away, unable to bear the weight of that gaze any longer. He keyed a command into the console beside him. A low hum filled the room, and the air began to shimmer as the atmospheric scrubbers activated, working to purge Rhys's scent. But Rhys was right. It was too late. The scent was already inside him, a seed of chaos planted in the sterile soil of his soul. There was a warmth spreading through his veins, a ghost of a feeling he could not name. And for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Kalen felt a tremor of something that was not order, not duty, but a cold, sharp spike of fear. The machine had a ghost, and it was beginning to stir. The interrogation had begun, but it was no longer clear who was interrogating whom. The silence was broken, and in its place was a question that echoed in the deepest, most secret parts of Kalen's mind. What if the terrorist was right? The days that followed bled into a seamless grey continuity, each one a replica of the last, marked only by the escalating tension of the interrogations. Chamber 7 became a crucible, a sealed world where two opposing forces ground against each other. Kalen deployed the full arsenal of the consortium's psychological warfare: sensory deprivation, temporal distortion, subliminal auditory pulses designed to fray the edges of sanity. He orchestrated a symphony of clinical cruelty, all while maintaining a placid, untouchable exterior. Yet Reese did not break. He would emerge from hours of darkness or disorienting noise, gaunt and pale, but with his spirit stubbornly intact. His defiance was a living thing in the room, a constant, low-level hum of resistance that vibrated under Kalen's skin. Worse, Reese had turned the interrogations back on him. He no longer taunted Kalen about his biology. Instead, he spoke of the world the consortium had stolen. He described the scent of rain on hot asphalt, the taste of real fruit, ripened by a sun Kalen had only ever seen through polarized glass. He spoke of music, not the mathematically precise ambient tones that filled the spire, but messy, emotional music that made you want to dance or weep. He talked about touch, the casual brush of a hand, the warmth of a shared blanket, the profound, anchoring weight of an embrace. "They teach you that touch is for control," Reese said, one session, his voice raspy from dehydration. Kalen had denied him water for the last cycle. A hand on the shoulder to guide a subordinate, a grip on the arm to restrain a prisoner. But that's not what it is. It's communication. It's saying, "I am here. You are here. We are not alone." Kalen recorded the words, logged them as attempted psychological manipulation, but they echoed in his mind long after the session ended. In his sterile, silent apartment high in the spire, he would find himself staring at his own hands, at the pale, unblemished skin. He tried to imagine a touch that was not a command or a threat. The concept was abstract, alien. He had been touched, of course, by instructors during training, by medics during biological assessments, by enforcers during drills. But it had always been impersonal, functional. The idea of touch as a form of comfort was as foreign as the notion of a sky that wasn't a uniform, light-polluted grey. The ghost in the machine was growing bolder. Kalen's dreams, once blank and silent, were now chaotic splashes of colour and sensation. He dreamt of running through a forest, the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves overwhelming him. He dreamt of a vast, open sky, so blue it hurt his eyes. In one dream, he was standing in a field of wildflowers, and a warm wind carried a scent that was both familiar and terrifyingly new: ozone and pine and scorched earth. He woke from that dream with his heart hammering against his ribs, a fine sheen of sweat on his skin, the phantom scent lingering in his nostrils. His biometrics monitor, synced directly to the consortium's central command, would register the anomaly: a spike in heart rate, a fluctuation in body temperature, minor deviations easily explained away as stress. For now, his performance reviews with director Valerius became fraught with a new, unspoken tension. Valerius was a man who seemed assembled from polished chrome and cool logic. A high-ranking beta, he was immune to the scents and pheromonal pulls that defined alphas and omegas, a fact he considered a mark of evolutionary superiority. He sat behind a vast obsidian desk, his fingers steepled, his eyes the color of faded parchment, missing nothing. "Regulator," Valerius said during their weekly review, his voice as smooth and cold as river stones. "Your efficiency metrics in the interrogation of designation. Reese have dipped by 1.7%. An acceptable margin for a standard subversive, perhaps, but Reese is a significant asset. His network is the most potent threat to social stability we have faced in a decade. His psychological resistance is formidable," Kalen stated, keeping his voice perfectly even. "His conditioning is deeply entrenched." Or perhaps, Valerius mused, a thin, humorless smile touching his lips. "The contaminant is more potent than anticipated. Proximity to a volatile, unsuppressed alpha can have subtle effects, even on a perfectly regulated system such as your own." He leaned forward, the smile vanishing. "You are my finest instrument, Kalen, a triumph of design. Do not allow a primitive biological echo to compromise your function. Extract the intelligence, or I will be forced to deploy a less elegant instrument." The threat was clear. Failure meant decommissioning. It meant being relegated to a study subject in the consortium's biolabs, his body and mind dissected to understand the point of failure. It was a fate worse than death. It was erasure. The fear sharpened his focus, but it also fed the tremor of anxiety that now lived permanently in his gut. He was walking a razor's edge, and the ground was beginning to shake. The change, when it came, was not a dramatic failure, but a quiet, insidious shift. During the next interrogation, Reese was visibly weakened. They had kept him in sonic deprivation for 18 hours, a high-frequency tone that vibrated the very bones and prevented coherent thought. He slumped in the chair, his head bowed, the vibrant energy that usually radiated from him dimmed to a faint ember. A glass of water sat on the small table beside Kalen, part of the standard interrogation setup. It was a tool, to be given as a reward or withheld as punishment. Kalen looked at Reese, at the cracked lips and the slight tremor in his hands. He saw not designation, Reese, the terrorist. He saw a man suffering. An impulse, alien and unwelcome, rose up in him. It was not logic. It was not strategy. It was something else, something that whispered from the deepest, most buried part of him. He picked up the glass. "Your hydration levels are suboptimal," Kalen said, the clinical words a flimsy cover for the act itself. He stepped forward, moving around the console that separated them. It was a breach of protocol. He was supposed to remain behind the barrier, but his feet moved as if of their own accord. He held the glass out to Reese. The prisoner lifted his head slowly, his green eyes clouded with exhaustion. He looked at the glass, then at Kalen, a flicker of disbelief in his gaze. Slowly, shakily, he reached out with a cuffed hand. Their fingers brushed as he took the glass. It was not a jolt. It was a detonation, a silent, white-hot explosion that ripped through Kalen's carefully constructed world. It was warmth, a current of pure, unadulterated life that flooded up his arm, into his chest, and straight to the core of his being. For a breathtaking second, the grey room vanished, replaced by a blinding flash of green, the color of Reese's eyes, the color of the forest in his dreams. He felt the ghost inside him roar, a wave of sensation so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. Scent, touch, emotion, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming moment of connection. He snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling away, the datapad slipping from his numb fingers and clattering to the floor. He stared at his hand, at the fingers that had touched Reese, half expecting them to be charred. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. His breath came in ragged gasps. The air was thick, not just with Reese's scent, but with something new, something emanating from him. A faint, sweet scent, like ozone after a summer storm, and something floral, like crushed petals. His own scent. Impossible. Reese watched him, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He lowered the glass, his expression transformed. The defiance was gone. The amusement was gone. In its place was a look of profound, startling recognition, and in his eyes, Kalen saw not the pity he expected, but a dawning, terrifying understanding. Reese wasn't just looking at a malfunctioning regulator, he was looking at him, and he was seeing something Kalen himself had never been allowed to see. The silence in the room was absolute now, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of a cage door swinging open. The descent was swift and merciless. It began as a low-grade fever, a persistent warmth that the climate controls in his apartment could not cool. Kalen logged it as a minor immune response, a reaction to the contaminant he was exposed to daily. But the fever climbed, coiling in his gut, making his muscles ache with a strange, deep-seated restlessness. His thoughts grew foggy, the crisp lines of logic and protocol blurring at the edges. The suppressants, the daily regimen that had been the bedrock of his existence, felt like chalk dust in his veins, useless and inert. His own body, so long a silent and obedient vessel, was staging a violent insurrection. The scent was the most damning evidence. The faint, sweet aroma he'd first noticed in the interrogation chamber was intensifying, blooming from his skin in waves. It was a scent of rain-soaked earth, of night-blooming jasmine, a delicate, almost painfully sweet fragrance that clung to his uniform, to the sterile surfaces of his apartment. It was the scent of an omega in preheat. He knew it from the bio textbooks, from the classified horror stories of the before times. It was the scent of vulnerability, of need, of a body preparing for the most primal of biological imperatives. It was everything he was not. It was everything he was trained to despise. Panic, a raw and unfamiliar emotion, clawed at his throat. He sealed himself in his apartment, cancelling his scheduled duties under the guise of a systems diagnostic. He stood under a stream of near-scalding water in his cleansing unit for an hour, scrubbing his skin raw, but the scent remained, an indelible part of him. He was a walking contradiction, a regulator exuding the very chaos he was meant to contain. If Valerius discovered this, decommissioning wouldn't be a threat. It would be a foregone conclusion. He collapsed onto his sleeping platform, the fever making him shiver despite the warmth. The grey walls of his apartment seemed to press in on him, the silence amplifying the frantic thrumming of his own blood. His world had shrunk to this single, terrifying reality. He was losing control. The ghost in the machine was no longer a ghost. It was a tidal wave, and it was about to drown him. Miles away, in the deepest, most secure level of the detention block, Reese sat in the sterile darkness of his cell. The sensory deprivation was a familiar enemy. But tonight, something else cut through the oppressive silence. A scent. It was impossibly faint, a mere whisper on the recycled air. But it was there. He lifted his head, his senses, honed by a life lived outside the consortium's sterile bubble, straining to catch it. It was sweet, achingly so. Ozone and crushed petals, rain on dry earth. It was an Omega's heat scent. But it was more than that. It was a scent he knew, not from memory, not from experience, but from a place deeper than both. It was a key turning a lock deep inside his own alpha biology. It called to him, a silent song that resonated in his very soul, and with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, he knew who it belonged to. Kalen, the cold, broken regulator, the perfect little machine. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. All the pieces clicked into place. The strange resonance he felt in Kalen's presence, the way the Omega's proximity settled something restless in him, even as they stood as enemies. The flash of connection when their hands had touched, a jolt that had felt less like an accident and more like a circuit completing. The consortium, in its infinite sterile wisdom, had tried to erase the concept of destined mates, of bonds that transcended social conditioning. They had dismissed it as primitive folklore, but it was real. And the cold, repressed Omega who held the keys to his prison was the other half of his soul. He was not just an Omega, he was his Omega. The irony was so bitter, so profound, it was almost comical. The one person in the universe who was biologically tethered to him was the one person tasked with destroying him. In his gleaming office, Director Valerius watched the data streams on his primary monitor. He ignored the feeds from the detention block, focusing instead on a single flashing biosignature. Regulator Kalen. The data was chaotic. Core temperature elevated, heart rate erratic, pheromonal output off the charts. The suppressants had failed, catastrophically. Valerius felt a flicker of annoyance. The Kalen unit was a significant investment, a prototype for a new generation of biologically compromised but loyal agents. A failure of this magnitude was a setback, but then his gaze shifted to the data stream from designation. Reese. The Alpha's vitals were also agitated. Heart rate increased, adrenaline levels spiking, even in sensory deprivation. A new thought bloomed in Valerius's cold, calculating mind. This was not a failure. This was an opportunity, an unscheduled, uncontrolled experiment. What happens when a conditioned, system-loyal Omega, stripped of his identity, is exposed to his primal biological state? And what happens when the catalyst is a pure, ideologically opposed alpha? The potential data was invaluable. It could revolutionize their conditioning programs, their suppressant technologies. He steepled his fingers, the thin, humorless smile returning. A new interrogation tactic, he murmured to the empty room. He keyed a command into his console, his movements precise and deliberate. Let's see how the terrorist's ideology holds up against raw biology. Let's see how our regulator's conditioning holds up against the storm. He activated the comms link to the detention block commander. Prepare designation. Reese for transfer, he ordered, his voice betraying no emotion. His new location will be Regulator Kalen's residential unit, level 47 Sector Gamma. Seal the unit upon entry, full sensory monitoring, no interference. This is now a level 1 observational protocol. The commander hesitated for a fraction of a second. Sir, Regulator Kalen's unit is containment grade, but to place an unsuppressed alpha in direct proximity to a compromised subject— Your concerns are noted, Commander, Valerius said, his voice dropping to a silken threat. And disregarded. Execute the order. The line went dead. Valerius leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the two flashing biosignatures on his screen, one pulsing with feverish, chaotic energy, the other with a steady, rising intensity. He was not bringing a man to another man. He was introducing a catalyst to a volatile compound. He was locking a storm in a box, and he was going to watch what happened when it broke. The chime of the apartment door was a shriek in the fever-thick silence. Kalen flinched, curling into a tighter ball on his sleeping platform. His body was a war zone. Waves of heat and cold washed over him, and a deep, aching need pulsed in his lower belly. It was a hunger for something he couldn't name, a profound, terrifying emptiness that demanded to be filled. The scent in the room was cloying, a dizzying perfume of jasmine and desperation. He was losing himself, the disciplined mind of the regulator dissolving in a tide of pure, primal instinct. The door hissed open. Kalen's head snapped up, his vision blurring at the edges. Two armored enforcers stood in the doorway, their faceless visors seeming to mock his agony. And then they stepped aside, and Reese was shoved into the room. The sight of him was like a lightning strike to Kalen's overloaded senses. Reese stood there, his prisoner jumpsuit stark against the grey palette of the apartment, his hands still bound in front of him. But it was his scent, his powerful, undiluted alpha scent, that shattered the last of Kalen's control. It wasn't just pine and ozone anymore. It was laced with something sharper, a possessive, dominant musk triggered by the overwhelming scent of Kalen's heat. It filled the room, smothering Kalen's own fragrance, hijacking the very air he breathed. It was an invasion, a conquest. The door sealed shut behind Reese with a heavy, final thud. A soft click echoed in the silence, the sound of the magnetic lock engaging. They were trapped. Together. Kalen scrambled backwards on the platform, pressing himself against the cold wall, a choked, guttural sound tearing from his throat. The part of him that was still regulator Kalen screamed threat, enemy, alpha. The part of him that was pure, terrified instinct screamed predator. He was prey, cornered and helpless. The carefully constructed walls of his identity had crumbled to dust, leaving only raw, exposed biology. And his biology was screaming that the man standing before him was dangerous. Reese stood frozen just inside the door, his body rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped his bound hands. The scent of Kalen's heat was a physical blow, a sensory overload that bypassed conscious thought and struck him straight in the alpha core of his being. It was 1,000 times more potent than the faint traces he'd caught in his cell. It was the scent of home, of completion, of everything he had ever fought for, concentrated into a single, agonizingly beautiful perfume. Instinct, raw and brutal, surged through him. Mine. The word was a roar in his blood. Claim. Mate. Breed. His muscles bunched, his canines ached in his gums, and a low growl rumbled in his chest before he could stop it. He saw the terror in Kalen's eyes, the wide, storm-grey eyes that had once been so cold and controlled were now shimmering with fever and fear. Kalen wasn't seeing Reese, the man who had tried to talk to him, to reach him. He was seeing a monster, an animal poised to strike. And in that moment, seeing that fear, something in Reese fractured. The alpha roared for dominance, but the man, the leader of the embers, the one who fought for freedom and choice, recoiled in horror. To take Kalen now, in this state, would not be a union. It would be a violation. It would make him no better than the consortium, which used biology as a weapon of control. He would be using Kalen's body just as they had, reducing him to a set of instincts to be manipulated. The battle inside him was titanic. Every cell in his body screamed at him to cross the room, to cover the terrified Omega with his body and his scent, to sink his teeth into the pale neck and claim him. But his heart, the part of him that had recognized Kalen not just as a mate, but as a person, screamed louder. Protect. With a supreme effort of will that cost him more than any physical fight ever had, Rhys forced his muscles to relax. He took a slow, deliberate step back, putting more distance between them. He lowered his head in a gesture of non-aggression, a primal signal he hoped some part of Kalen would understand. "Kalen," he said, his voice rough, strained with the effort of control. "I'm not going to hurt you." Kalen flinched at the sound of his name, a whimper escaping his lips. He was too far gone, lost in the inferno of his first heat. His mind was a maelstrom of terror and a deeply buried, shameful need. He could feel the Alpha's presence like a physical pressure, a gravitational pull that his body yearned to surrender to, even as his mind screamed in protest. Rhys's gaze swept the sterile, minimalist apartment. There was nothing soft, nothing comfortable. A sleeping platform, a functional chair, a chrome table. It was a cell, not a home. An Omega in heat needed a nest, a safe, enclosed space to ride out the storm. It was an instinct as old as their biology. Kalen, raised in this sterile world, wouldn't even know what that was. He had to help him. "It's all right," Rhys said, his voice softer now, pitching it to be as soothing as possible. He began to move slowly, not toward Kalen, but toward the sleeping platform's base. "I'm just going to make you more comfortable." He knelt down, his bound hands making the movement awkward. He tugged at the thin, coarse blanket on the platform. Then he looked at the severe, high-collared tunic Kalen was still wearing. It was too restrictive. "You need to get out of that uniform," he said gently. "It's too tight. You need to be able to breathe." The suggestion, however practical, sent a fresh spike of fear through Kalen. His uniform was his armor. To remove it felt like the ultimate surrender. But his skin was on fire, the synthetic fabric abrasive and suffocating. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and his trembling hands went to the collar of his tunic, his fingers fumbling with the seals. Seeing his struggle, Rhys made a decision. He had to get these bonds off. He turned his back to Kalen, showing him his restrained hands. "There's a release mechanism," he said, his voice tight, a pressure point on the left cuff. Can you help me?" It was a profound act of trust. He was making himself vulnerable to the man who, just days ago, had been his interrogator. Kalen stared at Rhys's back, at the tense line of his shoulders. The fever haze parted for a moment. This was not the act of a predator. A predator did not ask for help. A predator did not show its back. Hesitantly, shakily, Kalen slid off the platform. His legs were weak, but he managed to stumble forward. His fingers, clumsy with fever, found the cuff. He felt for the pressure point he knew from his training. He pressed it. The cuff sprang open with a soft click and fell to the floor. Rhys flexed his freed hands, rubbing his chafed wrists. He didn't turn around immediately. He gave Kalen a moment. Then, slowly, he faced him. He began to strip his own prisoner jumpsuit off, peeling away the rough, scent-soaked fabric. He was not doing it as a threat, but as an offering. He was giving Kalen his scent, not as a weapon, but as a resource. An Alpha's scent could soothe an Omega's heat, could calm the storm. He balled up the jumpsuit and placed it at the head of the sleeping platform. Then he took the thin blanket and the tunic Kalen had managed to shrug off. its fabric still holding the ghost of Kalen's own terrified scent. He began to arrange them, building a small, enclosed circle on the platform. A nest. Kalen watched, his breath catching in his throat. He was shivering violently now, clad only in his thin underlayers. The sight of Rhys, bare-chested, the lean muscles of his back and shoulders defined in the dim light, was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He was all power and raw vitality, but his movements were gentle, deliberate. He was not destroying, he was building. For him. When he was done, Rhys backed away again. "There," he said softly. "It will help. Get in." Tears, hot and unexpected, pricked Kalen's eyes. It was the first act of tenderness he had ever witnessed in his life. Pulled by an instinct he didn't know he possessed, he crawled into the makeshift nest. The fabric was still coarse, but the enclosed space felt safe. And the scent. It was overwhelming. Rhys's powerful alpha scent was soaked into the jumpsuit he was using as a pillow. But it was different now. Stripped of the aggression and dominance, it was just warm, protective. It wrapped around him like a shield, and for the first time, the frantic, terrified screaming in his head began to quiet. The fever spiked again, pulling him under. He cried out, a thin, wretched sound as a cramp seized his belly. He curled in on himself, shaking. He felt the platform dip. Rhys was there, sitting on the edge of the nest, not touching him, but close. His presence was a solid, warm anchor in the swirling chaos of the heat. "I know it hurts," Rhys murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the platform. "My mother was an Omega. I remember her first heat after the suppressants were mandated. The system failed. She said it was like being torn apart and put back together wrong." He paused, his voice thick with a painful memory. "There was no one there for her. My father. He'd already been taken." He wasn't talking to regulator Kalen. He was talking to the suffering Omega in the nest. He was sharing his pain, offering it as a bridge between them. He started talking, his voice a quiet, constant presence in the room. He told Kalen about his childhood in the Free Territories, before the consortium expanded and crushed them. He described the feeling of swimming in a cold river, the taste of roasted meat from an open fire, the sound of his father's laughter. He painted a world of sensation and emotion, a world Kalen had only ever known as a forbidden text. Hours bled into each other, the heat crested in vicious, agonizing waves. Kalen would thrash and cry out, lost in delirious fever dreams. He dreamt of the sterile creche, of the cold hands of medics, of Valerius's dead eyes. And through it all, Rhys's voice was there, a lifeline. When the shivering became unbearable, Rhys took the thin blanket and draped it over him, his fingers brushing Kalen's shoulder. The touch was brief, featherlight, but it sent a shock of warmth through Kalen's entire body. A quiet explosion that had no fear in it, only comfort. At the peak of the storm, Kalen's mind fractured. He was adrift in a sea of pure sensation, his identity erased. There was only pain and need and the overwhelming presence of the alpha. He began to keen, a low, desperate sound of pure animal distress. The need was a physical clawing inside him, an agony that demanded release. Rhys's heart broke. He could end Kalen's suffering. He could take him, bond with him, give his body the release it was screaming for. The alpha in him howled at the opportunity, at the raw invitation in that sound. But he looked at Kalen's face, twisted in a rictus of pain and confusion, and he saw the years of abuse, the lifetime of conditioning. He saw the boy who had been taught that his own body was a thing to be hated. To claim him now would be to prove the consortium right. Instead, he moved closer. He lay down on the platform outside the nest, on his side, facing Kalen. He didn't touch him. He just let his scent, calm, unsteady and protective, wash over the nest. "Breathe with me, Kalen," he whispered. "Just breathe. I'm right here. You're not alone. I've got you." Through the red haze of pain, something in Kalen registered the words. "I've got you." No one had ever had him. He had been a tool, an asset, a thing to be deployed. He had never been a person to be held. A new kind of connection was forming between them, something that had nothing to do with the primal commands of the heat. It was a thin, fragile thread of shared vulnerability, of trust forged in the heart of a biological fire. In the deepest, quietest part of his mind, where the ghost had once lived, a new voice whispered Reese's name, not as a designation, not as a prisoner's name, but as an anchor, a plea, a promise. In the observation room, Director Valerius stared at the main screen, his jaw tight. The audio feed was a stream of quiet murmurs, pained whimpers, and the steady, low rumble of the Alpha's voice. The visual feed showed the two figures on the platform, one curled in a makeshift nest, the other lying nearby, a silent, unmoving guardian. There was no violence, no primal coupling, no struggle for dominance. There was only stillness, tenderness. It was useless. "The data is inconclusive," a technician reported, her voice nervous. "The Omega's distress levels are decreasing, but not through the expected biological resolution. The Alpha is exhibiting unprecedented levels of control. His pheromonal output is protective, not dominant." "Inconclusive," Valerius repeated, the word a drop of poison on his tongue. He had expected to witness the savage triumph of instinct over ideology. Instead, he was watching ideology, a different one, triumph over instinct. He was watching the birth of something he couldn't measure, couldn't quantify, and therefore couldn't control. And that was intolerable. "The experiment is a failure," he declared, his voice dangerously calm. "Prepare a sanitation team. It's time to reset the variables." The calm arrived like the silence after a hurricane. The fever broke, leaving Kalen drenched in sweat but blessedly clear-headed. He blinked, his eyes focusing slowly. The oppressive grey of his apartment ceiling seemed softer, the light from the single recessed strip less harsh. He was lying in a tangle of fabric that smelled of pine and ozone, and him, a scent that was no longer terrifying, but simply his. He felt a weight across his legs. He turned his head. Reese was asleep, slumped against the edge of the nest, one arm thrown protectively over Kalen's body. His face, in repose, had lost its defiant edge, leaving him looking younger, vulnerable. The steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing was the only sound in the room. A hum. That's what it was. A low, constant hum beneath the surface of his awareness. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a connection. It vibrated from the point where Reese's arm rested on him, a current of warmth and quiet strength that seemed to flow directly into his own weary bones. The bond. It hadn't been forged in the fire of acclaim, but tempered in the quiet waters of trust and protection. It felt solid, real. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Reese. Every muscle ached, but it was a clean ache, the aftermath of a fever, not the twisted, anxious pain of before. He looked at his hands, turning them over in the dim light. They were his hands, but they felt different. He felt his own body, not as a machine to be monitored and maintained, but as himself. The world looked different. The grey walls seemed to have a texture he'd never noticed. The air, still thick with their mingled scents, tasted real on his tongue. He felt a profound, seismic shift in the very foundation of his being. The regulator was a hollow shell, shared on the floor with his uniform. The person who woke up in this nest was someone new. He was Kalen. Rhys stirred, his green eyes opening. They were clear, lucid, and held no trace of the instinct-driven alpha from the storm. He saw Kalen was awake, and a gentle smile touched his lips. He didn't move his arm. "Hey," he said softly. "Welcome back." "You," Kalen started, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You didn't." He couldn't finish the sentence. "No," Rhys said, his gaze unwavering. "That's not freedom, Kalen. That's just a different kind of cage. The embers fight for choice. I wasn't going to be the one to take yours away." The simple sincerity of the words struck Kalen with more force than any physical blow. He had spent his entire life in a system that had taken everything from him, starting with his own identity. And this man, his enemy, his biological counterpart, had been given the ultimate power over him and had chosen to give him the one thing he'd never had. A choice. They talked, for hours, not as interrogator and prisoner, but as two survivors on the far side of a storm. Kalen spoke of the creche, the cold, sterile upbringing, the endless training, the pain of the suppressant implant, the hollowing out of his own soul until only duty remained. He spoke of it all in a quiet, detached monotone, but for the first time he felt the weight of the words, the grief for the life he'd never been allowed to live. Rhys listened, his expression a mixture of sorrow and a deep, simmering anger, directed not at Kalen, but at the system that had broken him. Then he spoke of the embers. He explained that their goal was not simply to tear down the consortium, to unleash chaos as Kalen had been taught. Their goal was to build, to create a society where people could be whole, where alphas weren't just brutes, where omegas weren't just wombs, where betas weren't just cogs, a world where the bond they now shared would be seen not as a liability, but as a gift. "The consortium fears what it can't control," Rhys said, his hand finally moving from Kalen's leg to rest gently on his. The touch was a quiet affirmation. "They fear this," he said, indicating the bond that hummed between them. "Because it's a loyalty they can't manufacture. It's a strength they can't break. It's an order that grows from the ground up, not one that's imposed from the top down." He looked Kalen in the eyes, his own gaze serious and full of a hope that was both terrifying and intoxicating. "Valerius will not let this stand," Rhys stated, his tone hardening with tactical certainty. "He saw his experiment fail. He saw me refuse to be the animal he wanted me to be. And he saw you refuse to be the victim. That makes us loose ends. He'll order you for reconditioning, and me for termination. They'll be coming for us soon." A cold dread seeped into Kalen's bones, but it was different now. It wasn't the panic of a cornered animal. It was the sharp, clear fear of a man with something to lose. He looked at Rhys, at the quiet strength in his face, and felt the steady hum of the bond between them. He had a choice. He could surrender. Let them take him back to the labs. Let them try to scour Rhys from his mind and his biology and return to the grey emptiness of his life as a regulator. Or he could fight. "You're offering me a choice?" Kalen whispered. I'm offering you a future, Rhys corrected gently. But you have to choose to fight for it. With me. The bond between them pulsed, a silent communication that flowed faster than words. It was more than just empathy. It was a shared space in their minds. Kaelin could feel Rhys's resolve, his unwavering belief in their cause. And Rhys could feel the flicker of defiance in Kaelin, the spark that had survived years of suppression, now fanned into a flame. In that shared mental space, a plan began to form, built from Kaelin's intimate knowledge of the Spire's protocols and security weaknesses, and Rhys's experience with tactical improvisation and resistance networks. It was a desperate, impossible plan. They monitor all comms, Kaelin said, thinking aloud. But they don't monitor this. He touched his own temple, then looked at Rhys. They can't hear this. Rhys's eyes widened slightly as he understood. The bond was not just an emotional connection. It was a secure line of communication, a tactical advantage Valerius and his entire system could never have predicted. When they come to separate us, Rhys said, his voice low and urgent, his thoughts mirroring Kaelin's own. That's when we move. Kaelin looked at the grey walls of his apartment, the cage he had once called home. Then he looked at Rhys. For the first time, the future was not a pre-written script of duty and obedience. It was a blank page. And it was terrifying. But as he met Rhys's steady, hopeful gaze, he knew he would rather die writing his own story with this man than live another day in the one the consortium had written for him. Okay, Kaelin said, the single word feeling like the most important one he had ever spoken. Okay, the choice was made. The regulator was dead, and Kaelin was about to be reborn in fire. The alert chimed, a soft, clinical tone that sliced through the quiet intimacy of the room. It was the sound Kaelin had been dreading and expecting. A red light pulsed on the wall panel by the door. Sanitation protocol engaged. It was Valerius's euphemism. A team was coming to clean up the failed experiment, to separate them, to erase them. They're here, Kaelin said, his voice steady despite the frantic hammering of his heart. Rhys was already on his feet, his body a coiled spring of readiness. What's the protocol? He asked, his eyes sharp and focused. 4-man team, Kaelin replied, his mind racing, cycling through years of procedural knowledge, now repurposed for rebellion. 2 enforcers, 2 medtechs. They'll be armed with neural disruptors and sedative injectors. They'll try to sedate me first. You'll be classified as hostile. They'll go for incapacitation. And the door, it stays sealed until they input a sequence on the outside panel. The internal release is deactivated during sanitation protocol. They expect me to be compliant, or too weak to resist. Kaelin's lips twisted into a grim, unfamiliar smile. They're wrong. The bond between them hummed with a new, sharp intensity. It was no longer just a current of warmth. It was a conduit for tactical thought. Kaelin projected an image into their shared mental space, a schematic of his own apartment. He highlighted a small, almost invisible panel behind the nutrient dispenser. Emergency power conduit. Unshielded. A surge could override the door's maglock for a few seconds. Rhys's mind responded with an image of his own. The heavy chrome table in the center of the room. A barricade. A weapon. There was no more need for words. They moved in perfect, synchronized silence. Rhys, with a grunt of effort, heaved the heavy table and wedged it against the door, creating a formidable barrier. The metallic scrape was a declaration of war against the sterile quiet. Kaelin, meanwhile, went to the nutrient dispenser. He ripped the flimsy decorative panel off the wall, revealing a tangle of wires and a small junction box. His fingers, trained for delicate work on control panels and data ports, moved with deft precision. He didn't have tools, but he had a plan. They could hear the team now, the heavy tread of their boots in the corridor outside. "Regulator Kalen," a synthesized voice called through the door. "Open for scheduled maintenance. Your compliance is required." Kalen ignored it. He found the two main power leads in the junction box. He stripped the insulation with his teeth, the metallic taste flooding his mouth. He held the bare wires, one in each hand. The hum of the spire's power flowed through them. "On my signal," Reese said, his voice a low growl. He stood beside the barricaded door, his body braced, his hands clenched into fists. He had no weapon, but he was a weapon. The team outside tried the door. The handle didn't turn. "Protocol breached," the synthesized voice announced, colder now. "Forced entry authorized." A high-pitched whine began as they prepared to cut through the lock. Now, Kalen thought, broadcasting the single word to Reese through the bond. He slammed the two bare wires together. The lights in the apartment flickered wildly. A shower of blue-white sparks erupted from the junction box, and the smell of ozone, real this time, filled the air. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a loud groan, the magnetic lock on the door overloaded. The heavy table Reese had propped against it shuddered as the door was shoved open a few inches from the outside. It was all the opening Reese needed. He slammed his shoulder into the table, using the team's own momentum against them. The door flew back, the table crashing into the two enforcers at the front of the stack. They stumbled back, disoriented, their heavy armor turning from an asset into a liability. Reese was a blur of motion, a predator unleashed. He ducked under a wild swing from a neural disruptor, his fist connecting with the weak point where an enforcer's helmet met his collar. The man went down with a grunt. Kalen was moving too. He vaulted over the wall sleeping platform, his target the two medtechs at the back. They were scrambling for their sedative injectors, not expecting resistance from him. He grabbed one by the arm, using his knowledge of holds to twist the limb until the tech cried out and dropped the injector. Kalen caught it before it hit the floor. He spun, facing the second tech, and jabbed the needle into the man's exposed neck. The tech's eyes widened in surprise before rolling back in his head as he crumpled to the ground. The second enforcer had recovered and was raising his disruptor, aiming it at Reese. "Reese!" Kalen yelled, the name a sharp, clear cry. Reese was already turning, their shared awareness giving him a precious half-second of warning. He dove, the disruptor beam sizzling through the air where his head had been. He rolled and came up at the enforcer's feet, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The armored figure crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter. Silence. The four-man team was down. The corridor outside was, for the moment, empty. They had seconds. "Valerius's office," Kalen panted, adrenaline singing in his veins. "Top floor. He'll have triggered a spire-wide lockdown, but my access codes are still valid. For now. He won't expect me to come for him." "He won't be alone," Reese warned, already pulling a sidearm from the unconscious enforcer's holster and checking the charge. "He will be," Kalen said, with grim certainty. "He's arrogant. He trusts his systems, his enforcers. He sees himself as a chess player, not a soldier. He'll be in his office, watching it all unfold on his monitors, detached and in control." They ran. The corridors of the spire, once a symbol of order and control, were now their escape route. Alarms blared, red lights flashing, casting everything in a hellish glow. But Kalen moved with a purpose he had never felt before. He was not a fugitive fleeing. He was a key, unlocking the cage from the inside. His hand slapped against access panels, the system recognizing his biometric signature and granting them passage through doors that should have been sealed. They moved through service corridors and maintenance shafts, a route only a high-level regulator would know, avoiding the main thoroughfares where response teams would be converging. They reached the executive level. The air here was even more highly filtered, the ambient tones calmer, the grey walls polished to a higher sheen. It was the heart of the beast. The door to Valerius's office was vast and imposing, made of the same obsidian-like material as his desk. Reese raised the captured sidearm. "Let me," he said. "No." Kalen stopped him, placing a hand on his arm. The contact was grounding, a silent reassurance. "This is mine." He stepped forward and placed his palm on the scanner. For a moment, he expected it to reject him, to declare him a traitor. But the system was just a machine. It registered his palm print, his clearance level. The light turned green. The door hissed open. Director Valerius was exactly where Kalen knew he would be. He sat behind his desk, not looking at them, but at the wall of monitors that showed their chaotic progress through the spire. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem afraid. He simply looked disappointed. He turned his head slowly, his faded parchment eyes fixing on Kalen. "An impressive display of chaotic improvisation," Valerius said, his voice calm, almost academic. "But ultimately, a futile one. You have nowhere to run. The spire is sealed." "We're not running," Reese said, stepping up beside Kalen, the weapon held loosely at his side but ready. Valerius's gaze dismissed Reese, focusing entirely on Kalen. "You were my greatest success, Kalen. Proof that order could be perfected, that the weakness of biology could be overcome, and you throw it all away for this." He gestured vaguely at Reese, at the bond that was an invisible, screaming presence in the room. "For a chemical reaction, a pheromonal ghost, you're choosing chaos." Kalen looked at the man who had created him, who had stripped him bare and rebuilt him as a weapon. He felt no anger. He felt no hatred. He only felt a vast, hollow pity. Valerius wasn't evil. He was just empty. He was the system personified, cold, logical, and utterly blind to the one thing that mattered. "You gave me order," Kalen said, his voice quiet but ringing with a newfound strength. "But it was the order of a perfectly polished cage. You taught me to fear the sky because you could never control it." He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Valerius's. "You call this chaos?" He glanced at Reese, at the man who had shown him tenderness in the face of instinct, who had protected him when he could have possessed him. "I call it life." He reached out and placed his hand on Valerius's central console. His fingers flew across the interface, typing a string of commands he had memorized from the highest-level security briefings. A master override, a system-wide purge protocol designed only for the most catastrophic of containment breaches. Valerius's eyes widened in genuine shock for the first time. "What are you doing?" "You wanted to see what happens when a system fails," Kalen said, not looking up from the console. "Let's find out." He entered the final command. The monitors on the wall flickered and went dark. The alarms cut out, plunging the spire into an eerie, unnatural silence. He had just initiated a total system shutdown. All locks, all internal security, all surveillance, disabled. For the next 10 minutes, before the backup generators kicked in, the spire would be blind and open. He had just given the embers their key. "You're a fool," Valerius whispered, finally looking shaken. "You've doomed us all." "No," Kalen said, turning to face him fully. He looked at Rhys, and the bond between them was a beacon of warmth and certainty. "We've freed you." He didn't need to say anything else. He and Rhys turned and walked out of the office, leaving Valerius alone in the dark with his dead machines, a king of a silent, broken kingdom. The fight wasn't over, but they had broken the cage, and now, for the first time, they could see the sky. The 10 minutes of darkness Kalen had bought them were a lifetime. They moved through the powerless spire not as fugitives, but as ghosts haunting a dead machine. The red emergency lights were out, the blaring alarms silenced. The only sounds were their own footsteps echoing in the vast, empty corridors and the distant, chaotic shouts of confused enforcers. Rhys led the way now, his instincts guiding them toward the lower levels, toward the maintenance exits that led to the city's underbelly. Kalen followed, his senses still heightened from the heat, every detail of their surroundings sharp and vivid. He was no longer navigating by protocol, but by a new, instinctual map of the world. They found a service lift, its doors pried open by a crew of confused engineers. Kalen's override had frozen it between floors. Rhys found the emergency hatch in the ceiling and hoisted himself up, then reached down to pull Kalen into the dark, greasy shaft. They descended via the emergency ladder, the climb down through the guts of the spire, a symbolic journey from its sterile peak to its grimy foundations. The bond between them was a silent, constant conversation. "Left here. I sense air movement." Rhys would project, and Kalen would feel the certainty of it, trusting him completely. "That maintenance duct leads to the primary waste reclamation sector. The filtration system there is less advanced." "They might not have noticed us," Kalen would reply, his knowledge and Rhys's instinct weaving together into a single, seamless strategy. They emerged from a ventilation grate into a cavernous, humid space that stank of ozone and recycled water. This was the spire's hidden lung, the place where the city's waste was processed and purified. It was a world away from the polished chrome above. Here everything was damp, rusted, and functional. And here, for the first time, they were not alone. Figures emerged from the shadows between the massive purification tanks. They were dressed in patched, functional clothing, their faces smudged with grime, their eyes wary but alive. They held makeshift weapons, but lowered them as they saw Rhys. "Rhys," a woman with a streak of grey in her dark hair breathed, relief washing over her face. The signal came through. The whole spire went dark. "We thought—" "We're all right, Ilara," Rhys said, clapping her on the shoulder. He turned and looked at Kalen, who stood back, uncertain, an alien in this world of grit and raw humanity. He was still in his pristine underlayers, a stark contrast to the worn-out gear of the embers. Rhys put a hand on the small of Kalen's back, a simple, grounding gesture of inclusion. "This is Kalen," he said to his people. "He's with us. He's the one who opened the door." The embers looked at Kalen, their expression shifting from suspicion to a cautious curiosity. Ilara stepped forward and offered Kalen a small, worn flask. "Water," she said. "Real water, from the aquifers below the city." Kalen took it hesitantly. He drank, It was cold and tasted of minerals, of stone. It was nothing like the perfectly neutral, sterile liquid dispensed in the spire. It tasted alive. It felt like he was drinking the earth itself. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Ilara led them through a labyrinth of tunnels, a hidden city beneath the city. The air grew thicker, richer, filled with 1,000 scents Kaelin had never experienced. Cooking food, damp earth, unsuppressed human bodies, machine oil, growing things. It was overwhelming, a chaotic symphony that made his head spin. But it wasn't unpleasant. It was just real. Finally, they climbed a rusted ladder that led to a heavy metal hatch. Rhys pushed it open, and light flooded the dark shaft. Not the pale, artificial glow of the spire, but bright, warm, yellow light. Sunlight. Rhys climbed out first, then reached down for Kaelin. He took his hand and pulled him up into the light. Kaelin stumbled out onto a rooftop, blinking against the sudden, shocking brightness. He gasped, the air he drew into his lungs sharp and cool and utterly new. He looked up. The sky. It wasn't the uniform, hazy grey he had seen his entire life through the spire's windows. It was a vast, impossible dome of the deepest, most vibrant blue, streaked with feathery white clouds. It was infinite. It was beautiful. It was so beautiful, it hurt. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sorrow or pain, but of a profound, shattering awe. He had read about it, seen it in censored files, but the reality of it was a physical blow to the soul. He felt Rhys's presence beside him, solid and warm. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at Kaelin. He was watching him see it for the first time. From this vantage point, the city was laid out before them. The consortium spire was a single, monolithic spear of grey and chrome, piercing the heavens, utterly alien in the landscape. Around it sprawled the rest of the city, a chaotic, vibrant tapestry of older buildings, hidden rooftop gardens, and plumes of steam from unregulated workshops. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was alive. "The fight's not over," Rhys said quietly. His voice carried on a breeze that ruffled Kaelin's hair. "Valerius will reboot the system. He'll send hunters. The consortium won't fall in a day." Kaelin didn't look away from the spire. He saw it now for what it was. Not a monument to order, but a tombstone. A monument to fear. "He can't put the sky back in a box," he whispered. He felt the hum of the bond between them, a quiet, steady rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. It was a promise of shared dawns, of battles to come, of a future they would build together. He was scarred. He was remade. He was 1,000 miles from the cold, perfect machine he had once been, and he had never felt more whole. Rhys reached out and took his hand. It wasn't a gesture of possession, not a claim. It was a gesture of partnership, their fingers interlaced, a quiet, solid connection. The warmth of Rhys's skin against his was a simple, profound truth in a world of lies. Kaelin finally tore his gaze from the sky and looked at Rhys. He saw the alpha, the rebel leader, the man who smelled of pine and ozone, but he also saw his anchor, his partner, his mate. He saw the man who had shown him what it meant to be free, not by breaking his chains, but by showing him he had the strength to break them himself. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not a regulator. He was Kaelin. And for the first time in his entire life, standing on a rooftop under an endless blue sky with his hand in Rhys's, he was home. The war was just beginning, but here, in this quiet moment, they had already won the only victory that truly mattered.